I would like to welcome Myrto Kalouptsidi, Assistant Professor at the Department of Economics at Harvard University. And we will talk about China and the shipbuilding. Myrto, welcome.
Kalispera, Danai. Great to be here. It's a great pleasure to chat with you
Kalispera,
and
Myrto.
talk
We hope next year we will be together in the same
yes.
room. So let's go very quickly to our chat and how China succeeded in becoming the giant of the shipbuilding industry the last 20 years.
Right, so indeed in the last 20 years or so, we've seen China grow dramatically in shipbuilding and becoming the leading producer of ships in the world, overtaking Japan and South Korea, two of the other big shipbuilding nations. And, you know, it all started around 2006 when China, in its 11th National Five-Year Plan, appointed shipbuilding as a strategic sector in sort of direct guidance under the federal and regional governments to guide its development. And in practice, this meant several support measures to support the industry and to propel it to become the largest globally. In particular, they targeted the entry of new shipyards, so they provided subsidies that would encourage new shipyards to be created and built to support the industry. And you can think of this as essentially cheap land or other sorts of measures. They supported the investment decisions of shipyards, and you can think of this as cheap loans that are channeled through state-owned banks, whether at the regional or federal level. And they also directly targeted the production of ships. And this took the form of production subsidies, which can be things like cheap inputs, like cheap steel. It can be preferential buyer financing and all sorts of other types of measures.
In recent years,
took this outcome of a massive entry of firms in China. They were called greenfields, and they started taking orders even before they had their capacity installed. We saw dramatic rise in investment with both existing and new shipyards expanding dramatically their capital infrastructure. And we also saw a massive increase in production. So China's market share rose dramatically. It overtook Japan and South Korea. And the most impressive thing about this was not just that China sort of rose to be the leading country in the mid-2000s, but rather just how quickly this happened. They really managed to do this in the manner of a couple of years and overtaking all the other nations that had been building ships for a very long time, for decades.
In recent years, the Chinese government is explicitly targeting high-tech sectors to turn its firms into world leaders. How has China's industrial policy shaped its domestic and the global industry?
Indeed, so everything I described just now about shipbuilding is by no means unique to the shipbuilding industry. So in the last, again, 20 years or so, we've seen numerous sectors in China grow exponentially. So going back to the mid-2000s, steel, solar panels, cars, auto parts, shipbuilding, all of these sectors grew phenomenally fast. So we're talking 20 to 30 times in the manner of just a few years. And if we look at today, we have the very well-known Made in China 2025 plan, whereby China is targeting about 10 high-tech sectors like aerospace, robotics, and actually shipbuilding is still part of the strategic sectors. They are targeting high-tech ships and also marine equipment. So it very much remains high priority in terms of their strategic industrial considerations. So when you see China doing this across the board in so many sectors and over the decades, it indeed becomes a crucial question. Okay, there is this type of industrial policy being executed. How does it affect both the domestic industry in China, but also, since China is so big, the global markets? And it's a very important question, but it's in fact a very, very difficult question to answer, because you need to, on one hand, know what types of subsidies are in place, and then you also need to be able to make a prediction about what would have happened had these subsidies not been in place. And so for the first part, it's more complicated than people think to know what sort of measures a government takes. And that's for two reasons. First, because subsidies in many cases violate international trade agreements, governments tend to be secretive about the type of support measures that they use. But on top of that, in many cases, it's just inherently very difficult to know, to measure certain types of support. So think about cheap land. It's hard to know how cheap or free land is actually going to affect the future profitability of a company's lifetime. Okay? So what we do in our research is essentially build a state-of-the-art quantitative model for the shipbuilding industry, and we use it to first detect the subsidies that are in place, and we basically do that by looking for deviations between what economic theory predicts and what the data show us. And then we use the model to say, okay, now let's remove these subsidies and see how the industry would have evolved. And long story short, we find that essentially everything I was describing before is to a good degree because of subsidies. So we see that we would not have had this many new firms, we would not have seen China's market share expand to such a degree, nor its investment. So subsidies played a huge role in the evolution of this industry.
What did this mean for the shipbuilding industry? Were the policies effective?
Right. So as I said, these subsidies were really successful at boosting output, boosting investment, boosting the creation of new firms. But at the same time, they suppressed ship prices quite substantially. They moved market share from Japan and South Korea that we find were more productive producers of ships to China, which according to our findings, again, is less productive in producing ships. And perhaps most important, they created a massive excess capacity. This excess capacity also connected to fragmentation because you have hundreds of shipyards that entered during this period. And this was a really big problem when the crisis hit in 2008. So remember, we're talking about 2006. This is a period of boom for shipping and shipbuilding. And right at the peak of the cycle, all these shipyards are online, they're producing, and then the crisis hit. And the fact that you had these hundreds of shipyards really exacerbated the degree of excess capacity. They're now sitting idle, but perfectly capable of producing ships, further sort of reducing ship prices. So bottom line, the subsidies were very ineffective. We find that for every dollar spent, the government got back 20 cents. So really, basically, distortive subsidies. And this is related to something that is in general very peculiar about Chinese industrial policy. So if you look at how Japan and South Korea, who are classically doing industrial policy, so if you look at how Japan and South Korea do industrial policy, it's very different from what China did. So Japan and South Korea, they really target a small number of really big firms, which are going to be national champions, and they're going to compete globally. So think Daewoo, Samsung, Mitsubishi, also very big in shipbuilding. In contrast, in China, you have these hundreds of firms spread over different Chinese regions who are reducing the efficacy of such policies. And actually, the government recognized this and started introducing consolidation policies.
2 minutes left for a very difficult question that you have to cover it quickly, but I think you must. We have learned our lessons, we hope. The world has stopped, but not shipping or shipbuilding. Do you believe that we have learned our lessons in order to build the next 100 years, and One Belt, One Road is playing any role in this next 100 years until the next pandemic?
Yeah, it is a hard question, especially to answer in 2 minutes, if not at all. So I think we are in a constant learning mode in these industries, even more than any other industry because of the aggregate uncertainty and volatility that are present. I don't think we're ever going to be in a place where we will have learned or will be able to make predictions. But that said, I do think there are recent trends that could be a game changer. And I'm thinking the collection of big data that actually shipping is particularly good at in the recent years at collecting this information. Think AIS vessel movements that I've used in my research as well. And I think the combination of this big data with the type of sophisticated quantitative modeling that economists can do now can really help in studying different strategies and different policies, both for companies and also for policymakers. And I think in terms of China, I think it's the industrial policy in shipbuilding there is the same undercurrent as the Silk Road and other initiatives, which are partially in place to boost its global trade.
So, Myrto, thank you very, very much for this very quick chat. Let's hope to meet soon, to be in Delphi Economic Forum next year together. Thank you very much once again for honoring me.
Thank you so much. Thank you.